My name is Kristy Brauch Clougherty, and I've had the opportunity to meet all you already, but just to bring that up again. So today what's out at the table is sort of a synopsis of the life cycle of the butterfly, its symbiotic plants, and its plants that it needs and other pollinators need. And we're going to go through some of the different events that are occurring with monarchs and take a look at some other butterflies as well, because monarchs do not live alone in their environment. They live with other insects as well. And then we'll get down into some of the monarch diseases and monarch migration, of course. We're at the overwintering site, and look at some of the microscopes. So starting down at the plants, these three plants here are milkweed plants, and they are not plants that you would typically see in an overwintering site. So overwintering site, we're standing in a monarch overwintering site. This particular year, and the docents will tell you more about this site, but this site had some of the highest number of the California coastline counts this year. So if you're going to be looking at an overwintering site, this is the place to be this year, although it's pretty warm. And again, the docents can tell you more about the clusters and what's going on with the monarchs today. I'm going to talk more about what happens with monarchs in their breeding cycles and what's happening with the overall story of the monarch, the plight of the monarch, and their migration and disease and whatnot. So starting down at the plants, these plants you would not find at an overwintering site. It's not ideal to grow milkweed near any overwintering site within a 5-mile radius, and that's because monarchs go into a state of diapause when they arrive on their way to the overwintering site and during the overwintering season. So they don't need this plant, which is their host plant, right? They don't need that when they're not breeding and they're not producing offspring that are going to eat this plant. But slightly inland, in California, these plants are available to monarchs in different ways. So this is one of our native ones, and it looks a little shabby and small because it's dormant right now in the wild. In a pot, I can kind of keep it like this during the winter. It's up near the house, it's protected, so a little bit of what's alive underneath is alive above ground. But typically this plant goes dormant in the winter. Our California natives go dormant, and it's very much alive underground and not above ground. So this is narrowleaf A. fascicularis. And this is another native milkweed. You can see how different looking they are. This one's more of a desert milkweed, native to California and other areas outside of California. And it's kind of a newer plant that's available in our native nurseries right now, called A. subulata, or rush milkweed. And so monarchs will eat all of these milkweeds in their larva stage. And this one here, this is the biggie. I'm gonna hold this one up. This one is A. crosivica. This is tropical is its common name, its most common name. And this plant comes with some problems. It is not native to California. It grows south of the Tropic of Cancer in its native place and has spread a little bit further north out into the wild. And it's prevalent here in the United States and in California because it's sold at our big box nurseries. So this plant, monarchs do like this plant, just like they like these other milkweeds to lay their eggs on and have their breeding season turn over on these plants. But this plant comes with some problems, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. So let me talk quickly about nectar source. Equally important to monarchs and other pollinators outside of their host plants for their larva and or caterpillar stage is the native plants. And so this whole area out here is an all native garden that was put in here to support the nectar side of what monarchs and other native insects need. These are some cuttings from my garden. I don't have a lot of color going on in my garden right now, so yellow seems to be the color. These are two different yellow flowers, but there are flowers available for those native and non-native pollinators. This is a sage. You can smell that, get up close and smell that. This is a native sunflower bush, and this one's a gumweed. So these are some of the favorites. And again, there's always room for improvement in my own yard. I had provided you the plant list, a list of plants. And that plant list, why I like it to hand out is it has lists of plants that bloom all year round. So not meaning one plant, but different plants that would provide a bloom. So I'll be improving, trying to get some more color in different plants by planting more plants that next time, maybe next year, I can show you some other colors and other flowers. So milkweed puts out this seed. seed pod that opens up, and this is how it spreads. So one of the issues with this plant here is we want to try to keep this seed out of the wild because it's not native to here, and it does have some problems we're going to talk about. But generally the seeds all look similar from the native and non-native plants, and you can see how they would spread. They fly around on these little silk floss, so you can pass that around. And keeping this in the container the best you can. This is the floss separated. This is just sort of a fun fact. Back during World War II, across the United States, they had citizens collecting milkweed pods, taking the fluff or floss out, and they would use it. There it goes, that's how it travels. No seeds on that one. They would have that used to stuff life jackets and sleeping bags and different things for our soldiers at war. So it was a big push to collect milkweed across the United States during World War II. So you can feel it, it's really soft. And there's even a company up in Canada right now that's actually using that to stuff jackets instead of down, but it's like couture, so like $6,000. I won't be buying that anytime soon. So generally speaking, the life cycle of a monarch is pretty simple second grade stuff. It's just like any other butterfly during breeding season where it's gonna eat the milkweed, lay an egg, and then the caterpillar is going to eat the milkweed, going through 5 instar changes. So it's molting its skin, it's turning around and eating its skin for protein, actually eats the egg when it hatches, it's building up its protein and storage. And so I'll pass this around, but this is sort of a general image of the stages they go through, those 5 stages. And while they're turning around and eating their skin, they leave one thing behind, and it's the face cap. This little face cap comes off, and this is often found underneath where they might have just molted and eaten their skin. And so this is one of the ways we can identify the stages, is the size and shape of the triangle of the face cap. And there are other stages there as well. So here's an image of the egg. It's absolutely beautiful. They lay one single egg, typically under a milkweed leaf, so they tuck under. And you can flip through the different stages. There is that caterpillar eating the egg. So I'll pass that around. It has on the back the information with the different instars. So moving on from second grade, some of the things that are lesser known are how to determine the sex of a monarch. So we have, if you look here, we have male and females both represented here in these 3 panels. And the male will have these pheromone dots down here. They're no longer active, but they're still visible, and thin black veins. And the female has no pheromone dots and thick black veins. And not visible in these because these are probably 50-year-old specimens here, but maybe if you're lucky enough to see one flying around, or maybe if you see a pair that's mating, because it is getting towards the later part of the overwintering season, the male has a set of claspers and the female does not, down at the bottom of the abdomen. So you might be able to see them on this one, but really difficult to kind of see under the glass. So we have monarchs. This plant that we were talking about, the milkweed, all of the milkweeds, have what's called a cardinalite in them. It's a toxin, and the caterpillar eating this plant builds up those toxins in their body, and it makes them taste bad to predators. And that actually stays with them even when they move on to nectar sources as adults. When they eclose into an adult, they still have that poisonous flavor to them. So birds are not their main predator, whereas other animals, butterfly animals, like this painted lady, this one is also a migrator. You may have seen it coming through Southern California all the way up to Oregon. This one tastes sweet. It eats plants that don't have a toxin, and so birds like this one, but this one's trying to mimic the monarch in its color pattern, and it's saying, pretend I'm a monarch so you don't want to eat me. So that's the painted lady. There are several others that kind of get confused with monarchs from a distance. This one here is a Gulf fritillary, and I often get calls that say, I just saw a bunch of baby monarchs. They were all flitting around the yard. And I said, no, baby monarchs are caterpillars, right? So all butterflies are adults. Anything else, the teenagers or those first instars, those are the teenagers and baby monarchs or baby caterpillars, not the butterflies. And just some samples of some of the other regional butterflies that are found around here. The mourning cloak would be throughout California, and various different swallowtails. This is the western. We also have anise that's almost flipped in its coloring, that's more black with some yellow. So that's just to show you, these are all players in the garden. And on to migration. So this is a map of the Monarch Migration. I can pass it around. This migration map is divided by the Rockies, the continental divide. So if you look closely, you kind of see this gap area here. What we have is an eastern population and a western population. And the eastern population travel all the way from Canada down, they funnel through all the way down, funnel through into Mexico, and then that's where the last generation, they go in generation cycles, and then they end up down in a place called Angangueo, in the oil mill forest in Mexico. So that last generation is called the super butterfly, because unlike these ones that are just eating their nectar in the summer and breeding, these ones, they need to last the whole winter down there. So they have to be stronger than the others. They go into diapause, they're a little bit bigger. And it's some of the similar story with the western population. Ours are coming from north and from Arizona and over to our California coastline. If you can see the red here, those are all over 300 overwintering sites. Not all of them active anymore due to climate change, but 300 plus known overwintering sites. And so the area where we just left on our tour is the first generation spring release. So these butterflies that are starting to release from this site a little early this year, and all of these overwintering sites, their first stop to create a new generation where these ones that have lasted all winter are going to mate, and maybe they're mating here today, are going to fly off to where we live, and they're going to be looking for this milkweed to lay the next generation. So first generation spring is where we are. So there's a big push to start getting milkweeds that are growing a little different than what's been happening in the past. So this narrow leaf, this A. fascicularis that I mentioned, it comes up out of the ground at a later time than these monarchs that are leaving a little earlier. So things are not in line with the changing climate and environment. And so the authorities that be through Xerces are trying to get people to grow some of the more early emerging milkweeds. So you'll be seeing new milkweeds that you haven't seen in our native nurseries coming out over the next few years. So that's a program that they're working on right now.
How long does the journey take?
So typically, if you're talking about the eastern population, it starts at the end of August, and then they arrive there by, they literally look at the calendar as Dia de los Muertos. Like that's when all the people in Mexico, here they come, right? So you'll often see Dia de los Muertos have a lot of monarchs involved in that celebration. That's why, because down in the receiving end of Mexico, that's the time frame. For us, things are changing. We're seeing a lot of changes going on, but generally is similar. So September, my hard date where the breeding was going crazy and it stopped was mid-September, and maybe there were a few outliers that stuck around and didn't move on, but there was kind of a hard stop in September, and then they will overwinter to typically the middle of February. But as you can see, we're down to some lower numbers already. They've left early, which is another reason why we want to get that early milkweed going. Yeah. So I can pass this around as well. This is just kind of a fun little wheel that shows, let's say we have a breeding one that lays an egg in August, and that month's life cycle, and then that generation moves on in September, and then when that generation moves on in October. 3 or 4 life cycles is probably what we're looking at. That puts us into November, where we're going to start seeing our peak migration where we live, and then they'll be here by Thanksgiving, where they do a Thanksgiving count, and into December they're starting to arrive a little later. Sometimes the counts go up, although the last 2 years are throwing us all into like, we don't know. We really don't know what's happening with them, but you can play around with that and kind of think of how that would look on a map.
So when they do their count, it's like in a grid, right? Because you're not counting one by it, so you're taking a certain number and
so
statistically kind of taking that out.
For the eastern population, and I'm going to get to that right now, the eastern population, because it's basically one site. So there's several sites within a general area, like she's talking about on the grid, and that grid is about the size of 2, we call it football fields, but soccer fields in the United States. So it's about the size of 2 soccer fields, where these sites are located in Mexico, and that's where all of that population from the east is flying into. And so we don't have like site counts on this grid for the eastern population. They count them in terms of hectares. So the space is measured in hectares, and yes, they are doing estimates for small areas in Mexico of the hectares, and they have multiple counters and then do averages to get those numbers. So for the eastern population, again, these just got released within the last couple days, so these are last year's count. But the eastern population, I don't think they were released yet, but the western population was released. So this is missing this year's, which ended up being about the same. And so unlike the population and the count there, and again, the docents here can tell you, because there are probably docents that actually have done counts that are here, but they count them differently. So they work in teams, a pair, and they actually are looking at clusters, and they're counting what they see in the cluster that's visible, and they're doing an equation to take what is in that cluster in its entirety, and then they both take their numbers and bounce them off each other to come up with the number that would be the average. And there are multiple people counting the same clusters, so this is how they get their numbers. And so unlike Mexico, you can see this blue line are the sites counted. Again, not like Mexico with our one place they're going, we have these 300 sites. And last year they counted around 200 sites or just over. And we had been, you can see over time with less sites counted, dropping on the green grid bar there. And then we had gone from, we were up at 300,000, 200,000, and then down to just under 30,000. And so if you pull this up, this data that just got released, it's around 29,000 again this year. Kind of moved between different overwintering sites. We're losing more of the southern sites, even though they counted that many sites. Some of the southern sites are having much lower numbers than they were in the past, even Ventura and areas that used to have a more robust population. And then this site was the heaviest site, so over 6,000 at its peak at Thanksgiving. And then they do count again at New Year's, but the numbers had already started to drop significantly. So they were going somewhere, or weather had affected them, or something had made those numbers drop much earlier than it typically does.
Was there anything specific that happened between 18 and 19 to
Can
have
you repeat
such
the
a
question?
material drop?
So was there anything specific that happened over the last, not the current count, but the last year's count? No, and this is what's sort of throwing the researchers off. So yeah, so what it is this 2018 count would have been that 2018, the release the numbers in 2019. We just got the 2019's count released within the last couple days. So that's how the timing works on it. No, they actually don't have, whereas some of these numbers here, to go back to Mexico, this where it looks like, wow, they're recovering and everyone got excited. Researchers anticipated this because all of the weather and conditions were lined up like perfectly through all of the migration paths. Like they were having an ideal banner year everywhere they went, all of their generations. And so they said, we think unless there's some crazy storm that wipes them out at the overwintering site, which didn't happen, they had this ideal overwintering, the numbers popped up. Our numbers here, we don't have any indicators like that. There wasn't a storm or everything was perfectly aligned. What we do know, I was just at a Monarch Summit with some of the top researchers on this subject. Dr. Chip Taylor was focused on the 2-degree increase of temperature that's happening worldwide, but here in California we're seeing some not only pollinators that are affected, but other animals as well. So they're actually talking about not just for monarchs or pollinators, but plants, the plant side of things, bumping up the growing regions up by 2 levels, meaning up the state. So like if you took the longitude and bumped it up 2 growing zones, because everything's warming up, which might be why we're starting to see plants like this. This is a desert region plant in California and out in Arizona. Now it's at Theodore Payne Nursery, and I can plant it in my yard and it does fine, right? So, but this is the big question, and this is the mystery with monarchs here, is what's causing it. Climate change is the number one, and then pesticide use. So pesticides was a lot of research coming out on that. There hasn't been enough research, but what we know is neonicotinoids that come in the pots that you buy from the nurseries like this. This is a real shabby winter one here that I got from a neighbor's yard. And Bettina can have this one, by the way. And so shabby meaning it grows year round here, where these go dormant. We talked about the dormancy, and these do not. And so it gets a little scraggly if you don't cut it back. So kind of getting into this next part that I wanted to talk about with disease. Well, before I do that, let me I'm going to come back and kind of wrap into that question again. I'll bring it back, but I want to finish the migration piece, and then we'll come back. So I'm going to talk about disease and some other things that are related to the plant. So one of the ways that we know all these really cool arrows on the map, like how do we know all this? You know, it's a bug, it's flying around, is that we have these research projects, and we put tags, and I'll pass this one around. And this is a citizen science project that I participate in that's out of Cal Poly, called Monarch Alert. We put these tags on the wing, and they go on the discal cell, a certain cell on the wing, and you release the tag in the site that you are netting them wild, or some people rear them, and then when they're released, these people at the overwintering site are trained to actually look for these different tags. And there are 4 different Western tagging systems. Here in California, Monarch Alert is the only one that we have here. But there's 2 in Arizona, and 1 in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. So a lot of tags from Oregon are found in Santa Cruz area, and some even as far down as here and further south. So I have a friend by the name of Joe Billings, and he has his own tagging system out in Arizona, and he's had some significant discoveries this year. One of his tags, he tags all wild. He goes out into remote areas of Arizona near the southeastern border, and his tags have been found here. There's actually, I was hoping one of my friends that is here all the time has been one of the recovery people on that, and he tags both sides of the wings, so not just one side like this. He uses a fluorescent orange tag, and this kind of exciting story was he had a monarch that he released, and he's got 2 exciting stories, but one actually flew into the window of a classroom in Ventura, landed on the teacher's shoulder, and the teacher didn't know anything about it, and it sparked this big, great story. So we know that his tag actually made it all the way from there to Ventura. And again, tags have been found here from Joe Billings from that same location. But the big discovery this year was that he tagged a set where some went to California coastline and some went to Mexico. So the whole continental divide part is now, okay, we have a mixed area down in Arizona. So that's new information. And this is a set of what would be commonplace for that either last generation cycle, say those places in Texas, or where we are the first generation in spring down in LA or some of these inland places where they're laying their eggs. You'll often find the end of the overwintering wings on the ground where they've laid their eggs and they're expired. So they're either, these would be either flying long distances, although if you take a look around, you have to remember if some of these are coming from, say, Idaho even, they're in pretty good shape. Like, they don't look all that tattered most of the time for having to spend their overwintering. So typically in the life cycle stage of breeding, like any other butterfly, they live average of about a month, 2 weeks to 6 weeks. The overwintering super butterflies, they're gonna live up to 10 months depending on where they're coming from and how long they stay. So I can pass that around too. But that's a tattered wing of expired butterflies, and those were found all at one time on the ground after a site that I had been monitoring didn't have them there. So it kind of all happened at once.
No, this isn't predation, right? It's more
not that. So you could find something that looked like that, but that's a site that I monitor. They weren't there like just days before when I was in there doing counts, and I found all of those wings at the same time. So it was an indicator that there were some coming through, just end of life, probably some mating, which they can get pretty tattered during mating, and because I think there's a male wing right there, just end of life, and but a lot of eggs that came within that week. So talking about the predation and some of the things that are going on, I'm going to talk about the milkweed with the disease first, and then I'll get into some of these predators. So the plant that I was talking about, again, back to this tropical milkweed, like I was saying, it just grows year-round. It loves our Mediterranean climate here, even though it's not native. It's like I found the perfect home. And so it will grow year-round, and in the winter, it will start to get tall and stringy and leggy. And it starts to look a little unhealthy compared to its spring state where it's all flushed out. And years of it getting tall and leggy can kind of mean tall and leggy ongoing, but it will always have this beautiful bloom at the top. And so people really like it because it blooms year round. The problem with this plant blooming and growing and not being maintained is that it carries a parasitic spore called OE. And that spore is also on our natives. It's on all these plants. But this one goes dormant in the winter, and the spore load gets down to its normal natural environmental level. This one's gonna build up because it's not going dormant. And so what happens is you start to see butterflies that the caterpillars are eating that heavy spore load, and then they eclose like this. They're not viable. Or they look like this one, and they're flying around with the heavy spore load, spreading more of the heavy spore load. And you can think about that OE spore similar to a child that's been playing with really fine glitter doing an art project, and then a month later you're like, oh, it's still in their scalp, I can't get it out of the carpet. It's really hard to get rid of. It spreads similar to the way a fine glitter would spread. And so the OE has become kind of a problem, not kind of, it's become a problem on these plants because it builds up and it needs to be cut back when these native ones are going dormant to match the dormancy cycle, and then it puts the OE levels back to the normal state. So the other thing that does is it encourages the monarch to, okay, you know what, the daylight hours are shrinking, temperatures are changing, I can't find milkweed, I need to go into that state of diapause. So again, the docents here are going to talk about all the factors of the overwintering site and the diapause, but in those inland areas, that's what's happening is I'm getting the signal. I can't lay eggs anymore. There's nowhere to lay eggs. There's nowhere for my babies. It's time to go. So cutting this back, if you're going to grow it, ideally growing your native plants, they support lots and lots of insects, native and non, or cutting back this plant if you choose to grow it is the ideal way. These are a little harder to find than these. These are in all your big box. And again, you're not going to find neonicotinoids and pesticides in your native nurseries, but you're going to find them on the other ones.
Are these real, Mommy?
Those are real, yes. So I'll pass around just so you can see up close some of these OE samples. I often find these in school settings where they're just not maintained. They might be mixed in with the vegetable gardens, and you'll find crumpled monarchs just right underneath the milkweed plants. So another issue that monarchs have that they're facing, we talked about how birds, there are some birds that have figured it out. They're like, yeah, I'll deal with the bad flavor, or I'll figure out how to remove the wings to eat the part that doesn't taste as bad. So there are some birds that will eat them, but typically birds aren't their main predator. But this tachinid fly here, and I think I have a sample of this guy under the magnifying glass. This one, yeah. So as much as there are a lot of people that are like really mad at this fly and annoyed that this fly is killing most of their monarch caterpillars or chrysalis, this fly is actually a flower fly, and so it's a good pollinator. It's moving around, it's moving the pollen also, so it has a benefit. There are quite a few native ones and some introduced for agricultural purposes. Here's just a sample of some of the flies enlarged so you can see them, because these are a little tiny. But what happens is they lay they're an egg that is immediately hatching upon being laid on the monarch larva, and then that larva embeds inside the caterpillar, and then it eats the caterpillar from the inside out. Sometimes the caterpillar makes it all the way to a chrysalis, where you can see the chrysalis drops the string with the maggot that turns into its own pupa, and then the fly erupts. So that's another citizen science project that I participate in, where I actually collect caterpillars in their late stage, and if the fly comes out, I rear the fly to adulthood. Not rear it like feeding it, just let it do its thing, and then all of the flies collected get sent back to researchers, and they study which flies. So we know, because of these types of studies and citizens collecting this data, that the main fly that's the problem, not that there aren't other flies, is the introduced one, the one that was brought in. We've been talking a lot about bringing this. I'm gonna set this right by your hand, honey. Yeah, there you go. You can put your hand back up. So I do have a bee out here because this is a carpenter bee, female carpenter bee, but you can't talk about monarchs without talking about them in the community they live in. And bees are another big pollinator that are very important, but monarchs are an icon. Like, most people know what a monarch is when they see it, and it's representing what's happening with all of our pollinators right now, and they're declining. Maybe for similar reasons or not, but our entire pollinators they're declining as well. They're having a lot less nectar sources is a big thing. We always think about the host plant, but they need their nectar source equally. And if you think about, especially in places like California, we have so much development in areas where the milkweed was prevalent. We've wiped it out. So putting in just a small 3x3 area or container gardening with native plants and milkweed actually boosts the population of native insects significantly. So a small area can have a huge benefit. Yeah. And then I have this is some paperwork. I can pull out some other things for you guys as well, but this just shows under the microscopes the OEE samples. And so this is a super powered microscope. These are just ones that don't require being plugged in. So you'll see it not as magnified, but they look like little footballs amongst the scales on the wings. So butterflies have scales, not skin cells like we do. And so they'll be spread out all over the area where the scales are. And the samples that we take, I'll just pull this one out. They look like, that's the wing, but they look like this because we're actually pressing the sticker on the abdomen of the butterfly and pulling off some of those scales. And if it has the OE, those come off with it. And we can see one of these has OE and one of them does not. So just some of the, I think this is from 2016, but of all the samples sent in across the nation, you can take a look at some of these numbers. California's was 46% infected, and Florida, because that's another area that has, in fact, I didn't point that out, a year-round population. If you look down here, sliding, this little pink area, this is a year-round population here. And that population might have migrators coming through, but there's always monarchs going because of where it rests on the map. It's got all the climate and environment to keep them there, and this milkweed that's always up. But because it has a lot of this milkweed that's not going dormant, they have a 76% infection rate. And again, those numbers, just taking that into consideration, those numbers are coming from samples sent in. So the more people sending in samples for any of these types of projects, the better the quality of the data and the outcome of the research. So I would encourage people to, maybe they don't want to rear a butterfly and they don't want to do those samples, but get involved in some kind of citizen science project. And it can be as simple as taking a picture of something you see and uploading it to an iNaturalist application, and researcher using that data to put the bigger picture together of what's happening.
So any conclusion remarks before we go to questions?
Yes, so in conclusion, and I know I handed you guys out some paperwork on this, the question that usually comes to me is, how can I help? And I think I mentioned a few things, but how can you help is the best question that could be asked, because they need help. We've clearly altered the planet, right? Like development, you stand on the top of a building in downtown LA and you're like, where's the earth, you know? It's down there. We have the space to put plants back. It doesn't need to be knocking buildings down to put it back. So restoring what we took out and supporting large restoration projects like this is valuable, but that's not in most people's cards. Their daily life is too busy for that. And so planting natives, like I said, even in container gardening or small areas, will significantly change the amount of wildlife that comes into that area. Even if it's just insects, it's highly valuable. And trying to cut this milkweed back, if you're gonna grow it, ideally trying to plant natives. So that'll help stop the disease. Say you're not a gardener, this is not your thing. Educating someone else. Hey, I just went on this tour bus and I just learned about I see this in your front yard. Like, let me tell you the story about cutting this back. It's really important to educate other people, because this is not on the news. We got other stuff on the news, but this is important. It's all important information to get out there. So educating other people with what knowledge you have. And then your citizen science, like trying to do something as small as just taking a picture or reporting something online. And I've given you those cards to show you where you can do that. And I have a lot of other resources. So my business card that I gave you earlier has a whole list of links on different projects. I even have projects on bees. You're not really into the monarch, we're here today, you want to go home, I have some citizen science you can do for bees as well. So in conclusion, there are a lot of ways you can help, and there's even a whole lot more that I can't cover in an hour. So I'm going to leave it up for you guys to ask me questions and answer what you want to know. Yeah.